Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. This is a work of the Mediview Church of Christ in Mesquite, Texas. And now, here is Mike Heisel with today's lesson.
He cared not for the things of the veil, but trusted one who never failed. Oh, Daniel prayed, every morning, noon, and night.
Thank you for joining me today in our Bible study. If you haven't already opened your Bibles to Daniel chapter 10, please go ahead and do that. We're going to study that passage here in just a few minutes. But I want us to first consider the fact that we're almost at the end of our study of Daniel. We're going to have a video today on chapter 10. Probably we'll study chapter 11 in 2 videos, and then we'll get chapter 12 in a video. So we don't have very much longer in this book. So with that in mind, we need to be thinking about what we're going to study next. Since we've been studying an Old Testament book that has material in it that is not as familiar to people, a lot of historical matters that might be challenging to wrap our heads around all the dates and names and so forth, I thought it might be helpful for us to next turn our attention to a New Testament book, and one that would be a little bit more familiar. So my thought now is that we study the Gospel according to Mark next. Now, if you would rather study something else, please let me know. I can't guarantee that we'll study what you would like to study because we might have multiple suggestions coming from multiple people. But I think the criteria we use to figure out what we're going to study next would be, number 1, a New Testament book, and number 2, something that's a little bit on the more familiar side of the spectrum. All right, so all that said, let me know if what you would like to study next. But now let's start thinking about Daniel chapter 10. Now, we've pointed out that the second half of the book, which is chapters 7 through 12, deals with 4 visions that Daniel receives. And the fourth and final of these visions is found in chapters 10 through 12. Now, chapters 10 through 12 also, not only is it the last section of the book, but chronologically, it's the last material chronologically. Daniel chapter 1 deals with the earliest material chronologically, and then chapters 10 through 12 deals with the latest material chronologically, though in the middle there are some things that are out of order chronologically. But actually, as far as the dating that's given in the books, the material in chapters 10 through 12 can be dated the most precisely, that is, by Daniel's own chronological statements. Now, we can date precisely the events of chapter 5. I mean, it happened the night that Babylon fell, and we know that Babylon fell October 12, 539 BC. But we don't know that because of a statement from the book. However, the vision that Daniel receives in chapters 10 through 12 is dated to the 3rd year of Cyrus' reign, the 1st month of that year, and the 24th day. And so that's a helpful thing to have this dated so precisely. But as we look at this material, really we would maybe outline it in the following way. Chapter 10 verse 1 through chapter 11 verse 1 would be preparation for the vision that Daniel will receive. And then chapter 11 verse 2 through chapter 12 and verse 4 would be the vision itself, the revelation that's made to Daniel. And then chapter 12 verse 5 through the end of the book, which would be verse 13 of chapter 12, would be a follow-up. And really it would be an exhortation to God's people to stand strong until God brings them deliverance. Okay? So, that's the way that we would outline chapters 10 through 12. And as we've said, the overall theme of the book of Daniel is God's sovereignty. You look out at the affairs that are taking place in the kingdoms of men, and it may look like human beings are in charge, that they're in control. But in reality, the book of Daniel lets us know that God is sovereign. And God is in control, and that is made explicitly clear in chapters 10 through 12. But we're going to see that there's another nuance that's added in chapters 10 through 12. Especially in chapter 10 do you see this. And that added nuance is that it's not just the case that you have the Most High God who is sovereign over all of the affairs of men, but you also have His angels, and you have, we might say, demons who are warring against one another. And a lot of times the conflict that you see manifested among men is actually mirroring conflict that's taking place in the spirit realm among the angels and the demons. And so we'll talk about that more in just a few minutes. But that gives us a little bit added perspective in the way that we look at the conflicts that take place among men. Now, we'll see this especially next week. This vision that Daniel receives is not, in all respects, comforting to Daniel. It has to do with troubles that his people, that the Jews, are going to experience in the future. But the promise is made that God will deliver His faithful people through them all. Okay, so with that background material in mind, let's go ahead and pick up our copies of Scripture, and let's start going basically verse by verse through Daniel chapter 10. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message to him came in a vision. All right, so the 3rd year of Cyrus' reign. Now, this would not be in the fullest sense the 3rd year of Cyrus' reign, because Cyrus became king of Persia in 559 BC. He became king of Media and Persia in 550 BC. So this would be the 3rd year after Cyrus had conquered the city of Babylon. So this 3rd year, I mean, we would say the first year, he conquered Babylon October 12, 539 BC. Okay, so the way that it would work, his first year would be March 538 to March 537. The second year would be March 537 to March 536, and the 3rd year would be March 536 to March 535. All right, so this is going to be in 536 BC that this vision is given to Daniel. Now, Daniel here is called by his Hebrew name, but he's also called by the Babylonian name that Nebuchadnezzar gave him when he was captured in 605 BC, the name Belteshazzar. And we're going to see that the vision, now the vision is going to be what Daniel receives really beginning in chapter 11 verse 2 on through chapter 12 and verse 4, okay? And so this vision that Daniel receives, it's true, and it concerns a great war. And the great war is going to be the struggle that God's people find themselves in the middle of. And I'm not going to go into more detail about that now. We'll talk about that more next week and the next week, Lord willing. But this is not going to be, as we said, in all respects, a comforting vision for Daniel, because it's going to deal with a future horrendous struggle that the Jews are going to find themselves in the middle of. All right, but now we're going to see verse 2, the background to this vision. So chapter 10 and verse 1 is kind of the heading for chapters 10, 11, and 12, all right? And chapter 10 verse 2 starts kind of the background, okay? So chapter 10 verse 2 says this: at that time, that is in 536 BC, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. Now, why would Daniel be mourning at this particular point in time? Now, remember the vision that Daniel had received a couple of years earlier, chapter 9. So, it's the 1st year of Cyrus' reign, and Daniel, from studying Jeremiah's prophecy, comes to the conclusion that the captivity of the Jews is almost over. And so he begins to confess the sins of the Jews, that caused them to be carried away into captivity, and he begins to plead with God to fulfill his promise and to allow the Jews to return. And sure enough, God answered Daniel's prayer, God kept his promise, and God allowed the Jews to return. You can read at the beginning, for instance, of the book of Ezra, chapter 1, that in the first year of Cyrus' reign, Cyrus issued a decree that the Jews could return from Babylon or wherever they might find themselves and return to Judea, and that they could rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so when you read through the book of Ezra, sure enough, you find a group of Jews returning. In fact, you find almost 50,000 Jews returning. And they return and they start building the temple. They build the altar and restore sacrifice the 7th month of that year when they return to Jerusalem. And then Ezra chapter 3 and verse 8 makes the point that in the 2nd year after they returned, in the 2nd month, they laid the foundation of the temple. But then as you continue reading the book of Ezra, especially when you get to chapter 4, you see that the enemies of the Jews who had been living in the land since the Jews had been carried away into Babylonian captivity, they're not glad that the Jews have returned. They're very upset about that fact, and they're even more upset about the fact that the Jews are starting to rebuild the temple. And so they stir up opposition against the Jews. And the work on the temple stops. In fact, for about almost 20 years, the work on the temple stops. And so that may very well be the background to Daniel chapter 10 and verse 2. Opposition to the Jews rebuilding the temple and the cessation of the work on the temple probably would predate the events that are taking place here in Daniel chapter 10. So Daniel seemingly has heard of this, and Daniel is mourning for the Jews. You know, he prayed for God to keep the promise and allow the Jews to return. And in the vision that Daniel received, chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, you know, he knows that the temple is going to be rebuilt and the city of Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt. But now he hears of the trouble that the Jews are receiving, and so now he's mourning over this. And he mourns for 3 weeks. Verse 3 of Daniel chapter 10. And here's the way that he mourned. He said, I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. So it doesn't look like Daniel is totally fasting, but Daniel is not eating the delicacies, the choice foods. And of course, we remember in chapter 1, the book of Daniel begins with Daniel refusing to eat the Babylonian meat, and the book of Daniel ends with Daniel refusing to eat these choice foods, refusing the meat and refusing the wine. Of course, he refused the wine also, chapter 1. I didn't mean to leave that out. But then Daniel also is not using lotions on his skin. They're in a very arid climate, and so your skin would get dried out. And so, he's humbling himself. He's mourning over the trouble that his Jewish brothers and sisters are receiving in Jerusalem, and he's pleading with God to show them mercy. And then at that time, after 3 weeks of this, something very amazing happens. So chapter 10 and verse 4. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris. Now let me stop there. And I know I stopped in the middle of a thought, but this is an important point. Keep in mind that these 3 weeks that Daniel has not been eating choice food. He's not been eating meat, and he's not been drinking wine. These 3 weeks include the period of the Passover celebration. You remember we learned from chapters like Exodus chapter 12 that beginning on the evening of the 14th day of the 1st month and continuing through the 21st day of the 1st month, the Jews were to celebrate Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so, during that period of time, rather than thinking about the great event of the Passover, Daniel is mourning and he's fasting from these delicacies over the fact that his people have not been fully delivered. And this takes place, we're told, on the Tigris River, the bank of the great river Tigris. Now, the Tigris River would be to the east of Jerusalem. It was the Tigris River well, I won't give you all the geography of the Tigris River. You can look on a map and see that. I'm going to waste too much time giving you too many unnecessary details. But this statement that Daniel here, the third year of the reign of Cyrus, is not in Babylon, but he's standing on the bank of the Tigris River, it's important because of a statement that concludes chapter 1. Go back to chapter 1 and look with me in verse 21. And Daniel remained there. Now remember how Daniel 1 begins. It begins with Daniel being carried away into Babylonian captivity. So he's carried from Jerusalem to the city of Babylon. And when it says he remained there, it's in the city of Babylon. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now we know from Daniel chapter 6 that during the first year of King Cyrus, Daniel was still in Babylon. And what we saw in chapter 9 was an event that took place during the first year of King Cyrus. And it's not stated where Daniel was, but presumably he was still in Babylon. But now he's left Babylon. And now he's traveled east, and he's on the banks of the Tigris River because it's the third year of Cyrus. All right, so what happens after Daniel has mourned for these 3 weeks? Well, here's what happens as he's standing on the bank of the great river Tigris. Verse 5, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and his legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. So as he's mourning, he sees the vision of this glorified heavenly figure. Now the figure is wearing, verse 5, linen like what a priest would wear. And he's got around his waist, you would wear a belt around your waist because, this garment of linen would be a long flowing garment. So he's got a belt around his waist, and it's made from fine gold. And the gold is of Uphaz. No one knows where Uphaz is. There's one other reference to gold of Uphaz, and that's in Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 9. Usually you read in the Old Testament, when you read of fine gold, it's the gold of Ophir. But at any rate, here he's got this belt of gold, gold from Uphaz around his waist. And this being's body was gleaming. It's like topaz, which would be a precious stone, yellowish in color. But his face is bright. It's like lightning, and his eyes are piercing. They're like flaming torches. His arms and his legs gleam of burnished bronze. Now, occasionally we read of other figures like this. The angel that showed Ezekiel the vision of the temple in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48 is described, as being composed of burnished bronze. This is probably most like the vision of the exalted Christ in Revelation chapter 1, and it's caused some to think that maybe this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. So this is Jesus in his glorified state before he came to earth as a man. And they say that, again, because of the similarity with Revelation chapter 1. I don't think that works. And the reason I don't think that it works is because as we get deeper into chapter 10, we're going to see that an angel was able to restrain this being that comes to Daniel. And this being that comes to Daniel had to have the help of Michael the archangel to free himself from this angel that's been restraining him so that he can complete his journey and come and bring this message to Daniel. So it doesn't seem like Jesus would need the help of Michael to overcome an angel, since Jesus in the New Testament is described as the one who created the angels. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16. So it seems to me best to identify this being as an angel. Now, of course, twice earlier, once in chapter 8 and once in chapter 9, the angel Gabriel came to Daniel. Now this glorified heavenly being in chapter 10 is not identified. Name's not given. But at any rate, I think it best to understand this as a reference to an angel. And I don't think that I mentioned the fact that his voice is a booming voice, and what he says is going to startle Daniel. It's a voice that sounds like a multitude. All right? So let's continue on. Verse 7. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. Now, it seems like Daniel and his companions' experience with this vision is similar to Saul of Tarsus and his companions' experience with the vision of the resurrected Jesus in Acts chapter 9. You might look at a passage like Acts 9 verse 7. Those who were traveling with Saul, they saw the light, but they didn't see the figure. They couldn't understand what was said. And that's similar to the experience of those who were standing by the Tigris River with Daniel. They see the vision itself, that is the glory of the vision, and they're terrified and they're overwhelmed and they flee. But they don't make out the vision in the same way that Daniel was. And of course, same with Saul's companions in Acts 9. Verse 8. So I was left alone, gazing at the great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Now, Daniel is undoubtedly already somewhat compromised because of the mourning that he's been doing, because of the fact that he's not been eating choice food and hasn't been using lotions on his skin. He's upset, but this vision of this glorified being, again, probably this angel, it diminishes Daniel's strength even more. Daniel's face turns deathly pale and he was helpless. Verse 9. Then I heard him speaking. Now, keep in mind, verse 6. When this being speaks, he speaks with a voice that's like the sound of a multitude, so a booming voice. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. Daniel was so exhausted from the terror he experienced from this vision that he just falls face down asleep on the ground. Now, this isn't the first time that Daniel has reacted this way to a vision. You remember chapter 8 of Daniel and verse 18? While Gabriel was speaking to Daniel, here's what's said. Chapter 8, verse 18. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. So Daniel has a similar experience. And by the way, when in Ezekiel 1, there in Babylon sees the vision of God's great throne chariot as he comes to the exiles in Babylon, Ezekiel's response is to fall face down before this vision of Yahweh, Ezekiel 1 and verse 28. But then verse 10 of Ezekiel 10, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. Now, it's not specified whose hand. Maybe it was the hand of this, glorified heavenly being that has appeared to Daniel. Maybe it's his hand. Maybe it's like the hand that wrote on the wall there in Babylon in chapter 5. All we're told is that a hand touched Daniel, and it was enough to wake him up, and Daniel is still terrified. He's trembling, but he goes from being face down to being on his hands and on his knees. Verse 11. He said, now again with this booming voice of a multitude, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you and stand up. For I have now been sent to you. And when he said this, I stood up trembling. And so he speaks words to Daniel to reassure him. He identifies Daniel by name. This angel knows Daniel. And he says to Daniel much the same thing that Gabriel had said to him back in chapter 9. He says, Daniel, you are highly esteemed. You remember what Gabriel said, Daniel 9 verse 23, as soon as you began to pray, Gabriel said, a word went out, that is, a word from God went out, a command, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. You're highly esteemed. And we pointed out last week that Daniel was highly esteemed. In Ezekiel's prophecy in Ezekiel 14 verse 14, he's mentioned in the same company as Noah and Job. And of course Jesus, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, considered Daniel to be a prophet. So Daniel was one who was highly esteemed. And so this glorified heavenly being says, listen, I have come to give you words that you need to carefully consider. And so stand up and receive this revelation that I'm giving you. But again, Daniel is still terrified. Daniel stands up, but Daniel is trembling. Verse 12. Then he continued, do not be afraid. And whenever angels appear to people, people's natural reaction is fear. And the angel has to say, don't be afraid. You see that when Gabriel appeared to both Zechariah and to Mary in Luke chapter 1. So do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard and I've come in response to them. So he's talking about the first day of this 3-week period. Right? So this is the 24th day of the first month of the 3rd year of Cyrus' reign. So, presumably then on the 3rd day of the first month, Daniel began to fast. Not eating the choice foods, not using lotions. And Daniel is mourning, again, hearing about the trouble that the Jews are experiencing back home. And Daniel's trying to understand this. Why, God, would you allow them to be restored to Jerusalem with authorization from Cyrus to rebuild the temple, but why would they be facing all this opposition? So Daniel is trying to understand all this, and Daniel is praying to God. And the angel says, listen, the first day that you made that prayer, God was aware of it. Just like we saw in Daniel chapter 9. As soon as Daniel began to pray, God knew about it. And the angel says, I've come in response to them. So the first day that Daniel began to pray. So again, the 3rd day of the first month, this glorified heavenly being was sent from Yahweh in response to Daniel's fasting and to Daniel's prayer, and he's been sent to give Daniel this vision. Okay, so if this being, this heavenly being, was sent on the 3rd day, why has it taken 3 weeks for him to arrive? Back in chapter 9, it didn't take that long for Gabriel to arrive. As soon as Daniel began to pray, God was aware of it, and God sent Gabriel, and before Daniel was finished praying, Gabriel arrived with this message. Why has it taken this glorified heavenly being 3 weeks to come? Well, the answer to that is in verse 13. Here, the being says, and I'm just going to call him angel, right? The angel says, sometimes when you're preaching, for whatever reason, you come up with a long phrase, trying to give detail, and you stick with it, and it becomes this really clunky phrase that you just keep on repeating. But for some reason, it's like getting your foot stuck in a lard bucket. You just can't get your foot out, and you just can't quit using this clunky phrase. So anyway, that's what I've been doing so far, and I apologize. So this angel says to Daniel, verse 13 of Daniel 10. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. All right, so now we've just entered into some really weird territory. So this angel is sent from heaven as Daniel begins to pray. And as this angel comes from heaven, remember, Daniel is in Persia. Daniel's standing by the Tigris River. And so this angel comes from heaven, and he comes into the territory of Persia, but he's met, when he enters into the territory of Persia, with this being that's called, in verse 13, the prince of the Persian kingdom. Now, the prince of the Persian kingdom resists this angel. And it's like there's a wrestling match between this angel and the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Now, who is the prince of the kingdom of Persia? Well, it's not a reference to Cyrus. There is no possible way that Cyrus could fight with an angel. I mean, you remember what one angel did to Sennacherib's army in one night in 2 Kings 19:35. I mean, one angel in one night killed 135,000 of Sennacherib's troops. And you remember what one angel did to Herod Agrippa I in Acts chapter 12. Struck him so that Herod Agrippa I died. So the prince of the Persian kingdom cannot be a reference to Cyrus. The only sort of being that could possibly resist this glorified being, this angel, for 21 days and hinder him on his mission from coming to Daniel with this message would be an evil angel. I mean, that's what it seems to be the case. This prince of the Persian kingdom seems to be an evil angel, and so this good angel that was sent from God needs Michael's help, and we'll talk about Michael's identity here in just a minute. But who is this prince of the Persian kingdom? I mean, what sort of angel is this? I mean, it's an angel that is looking after Persia's interest and is opposed to this angel that's been sent by God to an Israelite to give this Israelite a message concerning God's ultimate deliverance of the Jews from struggles that they're going to experience. So who would this be? Well, let me invite your attention to another kind of weird verse that we don't talk about a lot in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Deuteronomy 32. Wow, I've already gone 31 minutes. Deuteronomy 32. And let's look at verse 8 of Deuteronomy 32. So this is the song of Moses. And so Moses was to teach this to the Israelites, and the Israelites were to sing it. And here's what's said. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. When the Most High, now that's God, gave the nations their inheritance, when He divided all mankind. Now when was that? That's the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11. And I mean, the whole story is told Genesis chapters 10 and 11. Right? So when He divided all mankind, He set up boundaries for the people. Now, the NIV, which translates the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, says, according to the number of the sons of Israel. Okay, now that's an interesting statement. So, God divided the nations, Genesis 10 and 11, according to the number of the sons of Israel. Well, when you go back and you count up all the nations, you know, those that descended from Shem and those that descended from Ham and those that descended from Japheth, you get the number 70. And it's interesting, you know, how many Israelites were there that entered into Egypt. Now, it depends on the text that you read and how they're counted, but 70. So I mean, that is a really interesting statement, that you have 70 nations divided up, Genesis chapters 10 and 11 at the Tower of Babel, and you got 70 sons of Israel. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a different reading that was discovered. And the reading from the Dead Sea Scrolls corresponds to the reading that's found in the Greek translation of the book of Deuteronomy. And here it is. If you've got an NIV, you see this in a footnote. Now, if you have an English Standard Version, you actually see it in the text. They translated this alternative reading thinking that it's the right reading. And what I've been able to tell, most scholars do believe that this is the right reading. But here's what the footnote says, and I'm gonna read it with the text leading up to it. When He divided all mankind, He set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, in the Old Testament, who are the sons of God? You know, consider the book of Job, chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 38. Who are the sons of God? Satan comes and presents himself before the Lord with the sons of God. Who are the sons of God? Well, in the NIV, it's translated angels. The angels are the sons of God. No one disputes that. The angels are the sons of God. And interestingly enough, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, which, by the way, antedates the Masoretic text, the reading is as follows. He set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the angels of God. So, but then he goes on to say, verse 9, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is his allotted inheritance. So here's the picture. God has given, if you will, patron angels to all these nations that he divides up. And these patron angels, if you will, look after the welfare of their nation, and they fight with the patron angels of other nations. But yet, Yahweh looks after the interests of Israel. Okay, so that seems to be the picture here. The prince of the kingdom of Persia is this angel, this patron angel for Persia. And he doesn't like this angel who's been sent to Daniel. Because actually in this vision, and I don't want to get too deeply into this, but in the vision that this angel is going to give to Daniel, it foretells the fall of Persia. And so the fall of Persia would, in ways, mean the loss of authority for this patron angel for Persia. Now by the way, before we go on in the text, you see some of this in the New Testament. You do see, for instance, Satan exercising dominion over nations. You remember what Luke's account says that Satan said to Jesus when tempting Jesus. Luke chapter 4 and at verse 5. Luke 4 verse 5. The devil led Jesus up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world, and he said to him, Satan said to Jesus, I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. Satan says, I have the kingdoms. And you remember several years ago we studied the book of Revelation. I won't take the time to read the text, but read Revelation 13. Who gives the Roman emperor his power? It's the dragon. The dragon is the one who raises up the beast. Who is the dragon? The dragon is a reference to Satan. Now, Satan, we know from other passages, has the evil angels under him. You remember, hell was created for, Matthew chapter 25 and verse 41, the devil and his angels. So that gives a little bit of context, Now, God is in ultimate control. Satan can only do in this world what God allows him to do. Now, that's abundantly clear, for instance, from the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2. But God has given some authority over the nations to Satan for Satan to run amok. Now, God has his reasons for this, but God is ultimately sovereign. And so this angel, this evil angel, who again seems to be under Satan, but this evil angel who's a patron angel of Persia, he wrestles with the angel who's been sent to Daniel. Now, you see angels wrestling other places, don't you? Look, for instance, at Revelation chapter 12. We will take the time to read this passage in Revelation. Revelation 12. And I wish we could go into this, but this would just lengthen our discussion, and I've got to find a way to shorten this because I got more verses to go. But after Jesus' exaltation to heaven, which is described figuratively in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 to 6, here's what we're told, Revelation 12:7. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael, and we're going to talk about Michael here in a minute, and his angels, remember Michael is an archangel, fought against the dragon, that's Satan, and the dragon and his angels, right, fought back. But he was not strong enough, that is, Satan and his angels, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. Again, some of that language that he has authority in the world. He was hurled to the earth and his angels along with him. Right? So a lot of questions that we have. There's a lot more questions that we can ask than what the text gives us material to answer. But here we see these angels struggling. Okay, So as this angel is trying to make it to Daniel, to give Daniel this revelation, he's tied up for 21 days with this patron angel for Persia. But then we're told, Daniel chapter 12 and verse 13, then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now Daniel is called one of the chief princes. In the New Testament, Daniel is called an archangel. Now in the Bible, only 2 angels are named. Gabriel, book of Daniel, book of Luke, and Michael, who's named here in Daniel, he's named also in Jude, and he's named in Revelation. Now in Jude, notice what's said about what's said about Michael. Jude verse 9. But even the archangel Michael. Now remember, Daniel 10:13 says Michael is one of the chief princes. And so putting the 2 verses together, to be a chief prince seems to be an archangel. He's one of the chief princes, meaning there are other archangels. Michael is not the only archangel, right? So, and not to go off into this more, but perhaps Satan was formerly an archangel. Satan seems to have been an angel. He's described, for instance, as one who appears as an angel of light, 2 Corinthians 11, verses 11 through 15. And of course we know that Satan fell because of his pride, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6. And so, maybe Satan was an archangel. Michael is described with his angels, and he fights against Satan and his angels. So maybe the correspondence to the way that angels are described as being under Michael and under Satan indicates that Satan is also an archangel. At any rate, but even the archangel Michael, Jude verse 9, when disputing with the devil about the body of Moses. You see, there's stuff that went on that mountain after Moses died that Deuteronomy 34 doesn't tell us. When he disputed with the devil about the body of Moses, did not himself dare to condemn him for slander, but said, the Lord rebuke you. So again, this idea of struggle. But Michael is an angel who looks after the best interest of the Jews. Consider how Michael is described in verse 21 of Daniel chapter 10. Look at verse 10. But first I will tell you, that is, the angel says to Daniel, first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. No one supports me against them. Now, not to get ahead of ourselves, but supports me against them, that is, the prince of the kingdom of Persia and the prince of the kingdom of Greece, who will come later. No one supports me against them except Michael, your prince. Now, your there is plural. So the idea seems to be he's the prince of the Jews. And maybe, I don't mean to get off in this too much, but you remember back in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, you might go back and read it again, God allotted the number of nations to correspond to the number of the sons of God or the angels of God. So he places an angel over these various nations. But then verse 9 says, yet Israel is God's inheritance. So the angels are patron beings over these nations, looking after the nations, but God is looking over Israel. But remember what happened when Israel went into captivity. God left. That's what you read about in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 8 through 11. It's about God leaving his temple, God divorcing his people. You read about that in the book of Jeremiah. And so now it may be the case that God is no longer the God of Israel, if you will, but now Michael, the archangel, is the one who is the prince for Israel. Now, that's going slightly beyond what the text explicitly says. There's some assumption in that, but that's a reasonable inference to make. Not a necessary inference. That is not demanded by what's said, but it's a reasonable inference to make. But, at this point, let me just say before we move on to the next verse, this ought to cause us to really understand that there's a lot more going on in this world than what happens when nations go to war against one another, when we go to the voting booth or whatnot. There are all sorts of spiritual forces that are working to cause various groups to rise to power, to bring down other groups from power. There's just a lot of struggling that goes on. And if God were to just open our eyes and pull back the veil, we would be absolutely frightened by what we saw. We should never discount the fact that this world is a world in which evil spirits work their will. You remember what Paul said in the book of Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 and following. He said, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood." Now, Paul's saying that as a prisoner in Rome. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against evil spirits in the heavenlies. So there's a lot going on spiritually in this world. I wish I could go on, but my time's almost gone. Verse 15. Verse 14. "Now I have come." So Michael helps this angel get free from the prince of the kingdom of Persia. "But now I've come to explain to you." So he's come to the Tigris River where Daniel is, to explain to you what will happen to your people, to the Jews. Now that's why Michael came to help, because Michael, again, is the patron angel for the Jews. "To your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come." And we're going to see, especially in chapter 11, it's going to be about what happens to the Jews during the evil reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. But we'll talk about that more in the next couple of weeks. Verse 15. "While he was saying this to me, I bowed my face toward the ground and was speechless." So Daniel, again, he's terrified. So he bows down before this great being and he's speechless. Verse 16. "Then one who looked like a man," and again, not explicitly identified, this is difficult to understand how many beings may be here, but one who looked like a man touched my lips and opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I'm overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone. I can hardly breathe. So Daniel, again, he's terrified. He's speechless, but this man comes and touches his mouth. Several times in Scripture, God or angels touch prophets' mouths to open their mouths. You remember Isaiah 6, as Isaiah is commissioned to the prophetic ministry, as he sees the Lord glorified in the temple. He says, woe is me, I'm undone, I'm a man of unclean lips, I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. And you remember how one of the seraphim came and took a coal from the altar, and that seraph touched Isaiah's lips with the coal, and Isaiah's lips were purified, and so he could prophesy. Or in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses, I think verse 9. Jeremiah, as he's being commissioned, he says, I'm just a child, I can't speak, I don't know what to say. And God touches his lips and puts his words in his lips and commissions him. And so now Daniel, his lips are touched, but he's still terrified. He just can't go on because of this vision. But then verse 18 of Daniel 10 says this, Again, one who looked like a man touched me and gave me strength. Do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed. Now that's how Daniel was described back in verse 11. You who are highly esteemed, he said, peace, be strong now, be strong. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Speak, my Lord, since you've given me strength. So essentially, Daniel in verse 17 says, How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? He's saying, Stop, I can't handle this vision. Please go away from me. I can't take it. But now he's been comforted, and so in verse 19, Daniel says, Okay, go ahead with the vision. I can handle this now. You've strengthened me. Verse 20. So he said, Do you know why I've come to you? Soon I will return and fight against the prince of Persia. Right? As he maybe seemingly is trying to make it to heaven, he's going to have to fight against the prince of Persia. Or maybe as he's, fighting for Israel's sake, maybe that's what he's going to do when he returns. Because again, the Jews are being hindered now that they've been allowed to return. In the Persian Empire, they're not allowed right now to build the temple because of opposition. So maybe this angel will go back and will fight against the prince of Persia so that the Jews can continue to build the temple. Soon I'll return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go, the prince of Greece will come. Now, chapter 11, we're going to see that he's going to prophesy that Persia is going to fall to the Greeks. So the prince of Greece would be the patron angel for the Greek empires. Verse 21. But first I will tell you, that is before I return to fight against the prince of Persia, first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. Now, the book of truth is this statement, this kind of strange statement that argues for God's sovereignty. The book of truth is going to be, or at least the book of truth is the book in which the material that's revealed to Daniel in the vision in chapter 11 verse 2 through chapter 12 verse 4 is found. And this is God's foreknowledge of the future. This is God's plan for the nations in the future. That's what the book of truth is. And Isaiah 46 verses 9 through 11 makes the point that God declares the end from the beginning, from ancient times, of things that are not yet done. God knows exactly how this world is going to end. God knows exactly what's going to take place. Now, He's ordained some of it. He hasn't ordained all of it, but yet He knows all of it. He knows what the free will future choices of people will be. And so this book of truth is God's knowledge of the future, God's plan for the future, God's workings in response to man's free will choices in the future. And a part of that book of truth is going to be revealed to Daniel in chapter 11. But he goes on to say, now the NIV puts it parenthetically, and I'm going to go through chapter 11 verse 1, okay? No one supports me against them, that is, against the patron angel for Persia and the patron angel of Greece, except Michael your prince, who was a patron angel for the Jews. Verse 1, and in the first year of Darius the Mede, now remember the first year of Darius the Mede, that's what we read about in chapter 9 of Daniel. That's when Persia came to power, defeated Babylon, and that's when the Jews' exile in Babylon came to an end, right? So, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and to protect him. Now, it's not clear whether the him is a reference to Michael. So, in other words, this angel fought with Michael as Michael fought to allow the Jews to be released from their Babylonian captivity, now that Persia has come to power, or whether the him has reference to Darius. In other words, this angel fought for Darius and strengthened and supported Darius because he knew, you remember we identified Darius in light of chapter 6 and verse 28 of Daniel as being Cyrus himself. It's just a throne name for Cyrus. But this angel supported Cyrus because of the fact that Cyrus would issue the decree for the Jews to return from Babylonian exile, which again is what you find in the opening verses of Ezra chapter 1. At any rate, here's what we know. Whenever rulers of this world do something, there may very well be spiritual forces behind it, moving them to act in the way that they do, using them to bless godly people, using them to judge ungodly people, using them sometimes to chasten people. And so a lot more is going on behind the scenes. Well, I hope that this study has been a blessing for you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call me. I apologize that we went on so long. I wish we could go on longer because this is just such an interesting subject. But if I were to go on much longer, I would say things that I don't know. So anyway, God bless you.
We thank you for taking the time to worship with us and to study a portion of God's Word. We pray that this has been an edifying experience and that you would join us again. Now, if at any point during the lesson you had some questions, please feel free to email us at mhisal@meadowview.org. The email is both on the screen and in the description below. It is our goal to answer every Bible question with a Bible answer, to speak where the Bible speaks, and to be silent where it is silent. God bless you. We love you.